Hello friends, did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. My name is Dale Tomos, and I've been pulling steel across America's highways for 23 years. In all that time, I've never had anything shake me the way that October night did on Interstate 40 near Amarillo. What happened at that way station wasn't supernatural. It was something much worse. It was completely sickeningly human. I was running hot from Detroit to Phoenix, a load of transmission parts that needed to be there by noon the next day. Good freight, good money, and I was making excellent time through the Texas Panhandle when I saw the sign. All commercial vehicles must stop. Way station 1 mile. Nothing unusual about that. I'd been through this checkpoint dozens of times over the years, but as I took the off-ramp at 2:47 a.m., something felt wrong immediately. The place looked different, not older, but more. Tall fencing topped with razor, wire that hadn't been there before, bright LED lights that turned the night into harsh artificial day. And cameras, lots of cameras. I eased my Kenworth onto the scales, everything legal and proper, but instead of the usual green light, the message board lit up with words that made my blood run cold. Proceed to Bay 3 for mandatory inspection. Driver report to office immediately. The man who walked out of the scale house wasn't wearing a DOT uniform. Black tactical gear, radio equipment, sidearm. His name tag read R. Kellerman, Federal Task Force. He moved like military, talked like law enforcement. Evening driver. We're conducting a joint operation tonight. Shut down your engine and come inside. The office had been transformed since my last visit. Computer workstations everywhere. Communication equipment I didn't recognize. Wall-mounted displays showing surveillance footage. And in the corner, barely visible in the shadows, I swear I saw figures watching. Men in suits who shouldn't have been there. License, medical card, logbook, and bill of lading, Kellerman demanded. Then he said something that made my stomach drop. We're also going to need your cell phone and your truck's electronic data. That's when I knew I was in serious trouble. What's this about? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Your cargo, we need to inspect it. The trailer sealed by the shipper, breaking those seals. Federal investigation supersedes commercial contracts. As we walked to the inspection bay, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Figures near the fence line watching. When I turned to look directly, they seemed to melt back into the shadows. Maybe it was the stress. Maybe it was the harsh lights playing tricks. But I kept seeing people who shouldn't have been there. The inspection that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced in 2 decades of driving. These weren't DOT inspectors checking for safety violations. These were federal agents tearing apart my load like they were looking for something specific. These transmission components show traces of rare earth elements. One agent reported to Kellerman, materials that could be used in guidance systems. That's when the interrogation began. 6 hours. 6 hours of questions about my customers, my routes, my deliveries. They had files on me, photographs of my truck at locations I delivered to. Records of my movements going back months. Your transportation records show regular runs between facilities we've identified as part of an international smuggling network, Agent Morrison from the FBI explained. She was young, maybe 30, with cold eyes that seemed to look right through me. The worst part, they were right. The automotive parts I'd been hauling weren't just transmission components. They contained materials that could be disassembled and used to manufacture guidance systems for missiles. I'd been unknowingly smuggling weapons components for over a year. We believe you're unwitting rather than willing, Morrison continued, but your cooperation will determine whether you face federal charges. It wasn't really a choice. Cooperate or go to prison. Either way, my career was over. They wired my truck with surveillance equipment and sent me back out there making deliveries to customers who were under federal investigation. Every conversation recorded, every movement tracked. I became a federal informant without ever meaning to break the law. The psychological toll was devastating. Every time I made a delivery, I wondered if I was handing over materials that would be used to kill American soldiers. Every customer became a potential enemy agent. Every load became a potential crime. During one delivery in New Mexico, I was so paranoid that I started seeing things that couldn't have been there. Figures in the loading dock shadows watching me unload. Men in suits standing just outside my peripheral vision, disappearing when I turned to look. The stress was getting to me, making me see threats everywhere. The federal investigation lasted 18 months. When it finally ended, dozens of people were arrested, millions of dollars in restricted materials were seized, and an international smuggling network was dismantled. I was granted immunity for my cooperation, but my trucking career was finished. Most of the other drivers who'd been used by the smuggling network weren't as lucky. Some faced federal charges despite being completely innocent. Others just disappeared. Their trucks found abandoned, but the drivers never located. I sometimes wonder if they got too close to something they shouldn't have seen. The weigh station near Amarillo still operates, but it's not just checking truck weights anymore. It's a federal inspection point, intercepting drivers who've unknowingly become part of international conspiracies. The agents there are fighting a war most Americans don't even know exists. Sometimes late at night when I'm driving through Texas, I see figures standing by the roadside near that weigh station. They're too far away to make out clearly, but they're always watching the trucks go by. Maybe they're federal agents. Maybe they're the criminals who got away. Or maybe they're just shadows created by a mind that's seen too much. I don't drive professionally anymore. I work as a consultant now, helping federal agencies identify smuggling operations. But I still have nightmares about that October night, when I learned that honest work could be turned into a crime without the worker ever knowing. The real horror isn't ghosts or phantom inspectors. It's the discovery that you've been working for the enemy without realizing it. It's learning that your cargo descriptions were lies, your customers were criminals, and your professional pride was being used as a weapon against your own country. Every professional driver should understand that we are targets. The freight industry is built on trust, and criminals exploit that trust to move illegal materials across the country. The cargo on your bill of lading might not be what you're really hauling. The customer who seems most legitimate might be the most dangerous. The weigh station near Amarillo continues to operate under the cover of routine DOT inspections, intercepting smuggling operations that most drivers never realize they're part of. For every conspiracy they stop, dozens more continue operating throughout the country. But sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if we caught all of them. Sometimes I see those figures by the roadside again, and I wonder if they're still out there, still using honest drivers to transport materials that could kill American soldiers. The federal agents who run these hidden inspection facilities are heroes, but for those of us who get caught in their nets, the experience is life-changing. Some inspections don't just check your equipment, they check whether you're unknowingly working for America's enemies. And sometimes learning the truth about what you've been hauling is more terrifying than any ghost story could ever be. That weigh station taught me that the greatest dangers on America's highways aren't supernatural. They're the very real criminals, who turn honest truckers into unwitting weapons against their own country. The horror isn't in what might be lurking in the shadows. It's in discovering that you've been the shadow all along. The investigation files are still classified, but I know there are more operations like this running throughout the country, more drivers being used, more materials being moved, more threats we can't see coming. Sometimes I get calls from federal agents asking about routes I used to run, customers I used to serve. They're still tracking something, still following leads that go back to that smuggling network. And sometimes they ask if I've seen anything unusual lately. Figures by the roadside, people watching truck stops, vehicles that seem to be following patterns they can't quite identify. I always tell them the truth. In this business, you learn to see things that might not be there. The stress, the isolation, the knowledge that any load could be your last. It plays tricks on your mind. But that doesn't mean the threats aren't real. Every time I drive past that weigh station near Amarillo, I slow down and look carefully at the shadows near the fence line. Most of the time, there's nothing there. But sometimes, just sometimes, I see figures watching the trucks go by. And I wonder if they're federal agents protecting America's highways or if they're something else entirely. The truth is, after what I learned about that smuggling network, I'm not sure I want to know the difference. Some secrets are too dangerous for civilian drivers to carry, and some shadows are better left unexplored. But the way station is still there, still operating, still intercepting threats that most Americans will never know existed. And somewhere out there, honest drivers are hauling cargo they don't understand, working for customers they've never met, participating in conspiracies they can't imagine. The horror of modern trucking isn't supernatural, it's the very real possibility that any of us could become an unwitting enemy of our own country, one load at a time. And the most terrifying part is that most drivers who get used this way will never even know it happened. They'll just keep driving, keep delivering, keep trusting that their paperwork tells the truth and their customers are legitimate until one night they see the wrong sign at the wrong way station and learn that sometimes the cargo you're hauling is far more dangerous than anything you could possibly imagine. That's the real horror story of America's highways, not ghost trucks or phantom hitchhikers, but the knowledge that evil hides behind legitimate business and that honest work can be turned into a weapon without the worker ever knowing. The way station near Amarillo is still there, still catching criminals, still protecting the drivers who don't know they need protection. But for every conspiracy they stop, how many others slip through? How many drivers are out there right now, hauling materials that could be used to kill Americans, completely unaware of what they're really carrying? I don't know the answer to that question. But sometimes when I'm driving through Texas late at night, I see those figures by the roadside again, and I wonder if they're part of an operation that's still running, still using our highways to move threats we can't see coming. The way station that changed my life was just one small victory in a much larger war. And in that war, every truck is a potential weapon. Every driver is a potential target, and every load could be the one that tips the balance between security and catastrophe. That's why I sometimes see things that might not be there. Because after learning what I learned, the shadows hold too. Many possibilities, and the figures by the roadside could be anything at all. But the trucks keep rolling, the loads keep moving, and America's highways keep carrying cargo that most of us will never understand. The way station near Amarillo taught me that ignorance isn't bliss, it's vulnerability. And sometimes the most dangerous cargo is the kind you never know you're carrying. The real horror isn't in what might be haunting our highways. It's in what definitely is. Criminals who use our integrity against us. Conspiracies that turn honest work into acts of treason. And the terrible knowledge that any of us could be carrying the materials that could destroy everything we're trying to protect. That way station is still out there, still operating, still catching the drivers who don't know they're criminals. And every time a truck gets pulled in for routine inspection, someone's life changes forever. The neon sign for Murphy's 24-hour truck wash flickered against the Oklahoma night sky like a dying heartbeat. I'm Gary Sullivan, been keeping my rig clean for 19 years. And I thought I knew every truck wash from Seattle to Miami. But what happened during my overnight stay at Murphy's had nothing to do with supernatural forces. It was pure human evil, the kind that hides in plain sight. It was 11:47 p.m. when I pulled my 2020 Peterbilt into the automated wash bay. My trailer was loaded with electronics from Dallas heading to Kansas City, and my truck was caked with mud from construction zones in Arkansas. The facility looked legitimate enough. Fresh concrete, updated equipment, LED lighting that cast everything in harsh white illumination. But something felt wrong from the moment I backed into Bay 3. The attendant who took my $45 was a kid who couldn't have been older than 19. Pale, nervous, kept glancing toward the office like he was afraid of something. His name tag read Marvin, and when he spoke, his voice shook. Might take longer than usual tonight, he warned, programming the wash controls with trembling fingers. Systems, been acting up, sometimes get stuck and won't shut off. Standard truck wash problems. I figured I'd be there for 2 hours max while the automated system did its work. I settled into my sleeper berth with coffee and paperwork, planning to catch some rest before continuing my run. That's when I heard the screaming, faint at first, barely audible over the sound of spray nozzles and pressure washers, but it was definitely human. A woman's voice coming from somewhere deeper in the facility. I cracked my window and listened. Nothing, just the normal sounds of an automated truck wash. Maybe I had imagined it. 19 years on the road can play tricks on your mind, especially during overnight stops when you're running on caffeine and adrenaline. But then I heard it again. Definitely a scream cut off abruptly, like someone had covered the person's mouth. I climbed down from my cab and walked toward the main building. Following the sound, the wash bay doors had sealed shut behind me with a heavy metallic clang that seemed too final, too permanent for an automated system. The office area was empty, except for Marvin, who was staring at security monitors showing views of the wash bays. When he saw me approaching, he quickly switched to different screens, mundane views of the parking lot and fuel islands. "Everything okay?" I asked, studying his face. He was sweating despite the cool October air. Fine, he stammered. Just monitoring the wash cycles, making sure everything's working properly." But I'd seen what was on those monitors before he switched them. Views of rooms that shouldn't have existed in a truck wash facility. Concrete spaces with metal tables, bright lights, and figures in coveralls moving around what looked like. I didn't want to think about what it looked like. "I heard someone screaming," I said, watching Marvin's reaction. His face went white, probably just the pressure washers. They make all kinds of noise, especially the older equipment. Sound carries weird in these concrete buildings. He was lying. Everything about his body language screamed deception. The way he avoided eye contact, the tremor in his voice, the sweat beading on his forehead. Something was happening at Murphy's truck wash that had nothing to do with cleaning trucks. I excused myself and walked back toward my rig. But instead of getting in, I circled around to the rear of the facility. There had to be another entrance, another way to access whatever rooms I'd seen on those security monitors. Behind the main building, I found a loading dock that wasn't visible from the front. Several unmarked vans were parked there, along with a refrigerated truck that was running despite the cool night air. The setup looked like a delivery operation, but what kind of business operates behind a truck wash at midnight? Through a partially open bay door, I could see inside the building. What I saw made my blood freeze. It wasn't a truck wash back there, it was a medical facility. Bright lights, stainless steel tables, equipment I recognized from hospital shows on TV. And there were people on those tables, people who weren't moving. I pulled out my cell phone to call 911, but there was no signal. Not unusual in rural Oklahoma, but the timing felt wrong. I needed to get closer to see exactly what was happening, but every instinct told me to run. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. "You shouldn't be back here." I turned to find two men in coveralls approaching. They didn't look like truck wash employees. They looked like hospital orderlies or morgue attendants. Clean, professional, and completely out of place at a commercial vehicle wash facility. "Just looking for a bathroom," I lied, backing away from them. "Bathrooms in the front office," the taller one said. His voice was calm, professional, like he dealt with wandering truckers all the time. "You need to return to your vehicle. Your wash cycle isn't complete." They escorted me back to my truck, staying close enough that I couldn't run, but far enough that it didn't look like an arrest. To anyone watching, it would have appeared like helpful employees making sure a customer didn't get lost. But I knew better. Whatever was happening at Murphy's, it was big enough to require security, organized enough to have procedures for dealing with curious drivers, and sophisticated enough to operate behind the cover of a legitimate business. Back in my cab, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. The medical equipment, the unconscious people, the refrigerated truck, the professional way those men had handled my intrusion. It all pointed to something that made my stomach turn. Organ harvesting. The thought hit me like a physical blow. Murphy's truck wash was a front for an organ trafficking operation. The medical facility in the back was where they processed their victims, and the refrigerated truck was how they transported the harvested organs. But who were the victims, and how did they get them? I thought about the other trucks I'd seen in the wash bays. Drivers who might have wandered into the wrong area, seen something they shouldn't have seen, asked too many questions. Drivers who might have become unwilling donors to keep the operation secret. My wash cycle should have been finished by now, but the bay doors remained locked. I was trapped in my truck while people in the facility decided what to do about me. Whether I was a threat that needed to be eliminated or just a curious driver who could be intimidated into silence. Through my windshield, I could see Marvin in the office talking animatedly on a phone, making a report, probably describing the driver who'd seen too much, asking for instructions on how to handle the situation. The minutes crawled by, 1 hour, 2 hours. My truck sat in the wash bay while nothing happened except the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Whatever they were discussing, it was taking time to resolve. Finally, at 3:47 a.m., the bay doors opened with their normal pneumatic hiss. Marvin appeared at my window, looking relieved but still nervous. "Sorry about the delay," he said, his voice artificially cheerful. "Technical problems with the wash system. Everything's working. Fine now." My truck looked the same as when I'd entered. No cleaner, no different. Whatever had happened during those 4 hours, it hadn't involved washing my vehicle. I started my engine and prepared to leave, but Marvin's next words stopped me cold. "Drive safe out there," he said, his tone carrying an unmistakable threat. "And remember, some things are better left private. Truck wash business is competitive and rumors can really hurt a facility's reputation. It wasn't advice, it was a warning." I drove out of Murphy's and didn't stop until I reached a well-lit truck stop 50 miles away. There, surrounded by other drivers and normal activity, I tried to call 911 again. This time, I had signal, but when I described what I'd seen, the dispatcher seemed skeptical. "Sir, are you reporting a crime in progress or suspicious activity? Because if you didn't actually witness anything illegal, how do you explain to a 911 operator that you saw medical equipment in a truck wash? Unconscious people on tables and refrigerated trucks making midnight deliveries?" Without hard evidence, it sounded like the paranoid delusions of an overtired driver, but I kept trying. FBI field office in Oklahoma City, state police, even the local sheriff's department. Everyone wanted evidence I didn't have, witnesses I couldn't provide, specifics I couldn't give, without admitting I'd been trespassing on private property. 3 weeks later, I read a news story that made my hands shake. Murphy's 24-hour truck wash had been raided by federal agents in a multi-state operation targeting organ trafficking. Dozens of people were arrested. Millions of dollars in equipment was seized and evidence was recovered linking the facility to the disappearances of over 40 people. The victims weren't random. They were carefully selected. Homeless individuals, undocumented immigrants, runaway, teenagers, people who wouldn't be missed, who had no families to report them missing, who could disappear without triggering major investigations. But some victims were truckers, professional drivers who had stopped at the wrong facility at the wrong time, who had seen something they shouldn't have seen, who had become liabilities that needed to be eliminated. According to the FBI report, the Murphy's operation had been running for over 3 years, using the truck wash as a front to identify potential victims among the transient population that frequented commercial vehicle facilities. Drivers would disappear. During routine stops, their trucks abandoned in the parking lot while their bodies were harvested for organs that were sold to buyers throughout the world. The investigation revealed that similar operations were running at truck stops and service facilities throughout the country, all connected to an international network that specialized in acquiring organs from victims who wouldn't be missed. The trucking industry's transient nature made it perfect cover for operations that required both victims and transportation. Marvin, the nervous kid who had taken my money, was arrested as part of the operation, but during questioning, he claimed he'd been trying to protect drivers from what was happening in the back rooms. The delays, the technical problems, the nervous behavior. It had all been his way of giving potential victims time to leave before they could be selected for harvesting. "I couldn't stop what was happening," he told investigators. "But I could slow it down, give people chances to get away. Some drivers were just there for truck washes. Others were asking too many questions, getting too curious. Those were the ones who usually didn't leave." According to his testimony, I had been marked for elimination that night. My curiosity about the screaming, my exploration of the facility's rear areas, my obvious suspicion about what was happening. It had all been reported to the operations leaders as evidence that I was a threat. The 4-hour delay in my wash cycle had been spent debating whether to let me leave or add me to their victim list. In the end, they decided that killing a driver with a tight delivery schedule would trigger too much attention from dispatch and law enforcement. But it had been close, closer than I ever wanted to imagine. The FBI agent who interviewed me, Special Agent Rita Morrison, explained that organ trafficking operations specifically targeted the trucking industry because of the mobility and anonymity it provided. Truck stops are perfect hunting grounds, she said. Drivers are traveling alone, often on irregular schedules, dealing with facilities they've never seen before. If someone disappears, it might be days or weeks before anyone notices. The Murphy's operation had been one of the largest organ trafficking rings ever discovered in the United States, responsible for hundreds of victims over nearly a decade. The truck wash had been just one of their facilities. They also operated false rest stops, fake repair shops, and fraudulent fuel stations throughout the country. Every professional driver should understand that they're potential targets. Agent Morrison warned. These operations look for isolated travelers with valuable organs, people who can disappear without triggering immediate investigations. The trucking community's independence and mobility make it attractive to criminals who need both victims and transportation. I returned to Murphy's location 6 months later during the day to see what remained of the facility. The truck wash had been demolished, but the concrete foundation was still visible, along with evidence of the underground rooms where the medical equipment had been located. Local residents told me that strange things had been happening at Murphy's for years. Trucks entering but never leaving. Screaming sounds during overnight hours. Refrigerated vehicles making deliveries that couldn't be explained. But truck washes are noisy places, and the community had assumed the sounds were just industrial equipment operating during off-peak hours. We knew something wasn't right, one local farmer told me. But truck stops have their own rhythms, their own sounds. Easy to dismiss things that don't fit when you're not looking for criminal activity. The experience changed how I approach overnight stops at unfamiliar facilities. I research truck washes before I use them, check online reviews and driver forums for reports of unusual activity or disappearances. I carry multiple communication devices to ensure I can call for help if something goes wrong. Most importantly, I trust my instincts. When something feels wrong, when employees seem nervous, when procedures don't match normal operations, when I hear sounds that don't belong, I leave immediately. No truck wash is worth risking your life for. The organ trafficking industry continues to target professional drivers throughout the country, using our mobility and independence against us. Every overnight stop at an unfamiliar facility is a potential encounter with criminals who see us as walking repositories of valuable organs. Murphy's 24-hour truck wash taught me that evil often hides behind legitimate business facades, and that the screaming you hear might not be pressure washers or industrial equipment. Sometimes it's human suffering, and sometimes the only thing standing between you and becoming the next victim is your willingness to trust your instincts and leave when something doesn't feel right. The truck wash industry has implemented enhanced security measures and background check procedures since the Murphy's raid. But Agent Morrison warns that similar operations are still active throughout the country. Every facility that caters to transient populations is a potential front for human trafficking. She explained the best protection is education, awareness, and the courage to report suspicious activity. Today, when I need truck wash services, I stick to major chain facilities with established reputations and heavy traffic. I avoid isolated operations that seem too good to be true, and I never ignore the voice in my head that says something isn't right, because sometimes that voice is the only thing standing between a routine truck wash and becoming an unwilling organ donor for criminals who turn human suffering into profit. Murphy's taught me that the most dangerous facilities are often the ones that look most legitimate, and that the screaming you hear might be your last warning to get out while you still can. The neon signs still flicker at truck washes throughout Oklahoma and beyond, advertising 24-hour service and competitive prices. But some of those signs are beacons for predators who understand that professional drivers are perfect victims, mobile, isolated, and often far from home when they disappear. Murphy's 24-hour truck wash is gone, but the lesson it taught remains. Not every service facility is what it appears to be. And sometimes the most routine stops can become encounters with evil that uses our industry's trust and efficiency against us. The real horror isn't supernatural forces or ghostly mechanics. It's the very human evil that preys on drivers who need basic services, turning routine maintenance stops into potential death traps for anyone unlucky enough to see too much or ask too many questions. But the screaming I heard that night wasn't pipes or pressure washers. It was human suffering. And it serves as a reminder that some facilities wash more than trucks. They clean up evidence of crimes that most people can't imagine. The Murphys operation was stopped. But how many similar facilities are still operating throughout the country? How many drivers have disappeared during routine truck washes, their organs harvested by criminals who understand that mobile victims are the hardest to trace? I don't know the answers to those questions, but every time I see a truck wash with too good to be true prices or overly nervous employees, I remember the screaming I heard at Murphy's. And I keep driving until I find a facility where the only thing being washed is vehicles. Because in the trucking industry, paranoia isn't a mental illness, it's a survival skill. And sometimes the difference between a clean truck and a harvested organ is just being smart enough to recognize when something doesn't sound right and brave enough to leave before you become the next victim. Music Bay 17 at the Meridian Distribution Center was supposed to be a routine pickup. I'm Hank Williams. No, not the singer. Just a trucker with an unfortunate name who's been hauling freight for 26 years without ever finding anything in a trailer that wasn't listed on the bill of lading. But what my partner Doug and I discovered that November night in what should have been a sealed, refrigerated trailer containing frozen vegetables changed both our lives forever and made us witnesses to horrors that still wake us up screaming. The load was manifested as organic frozen produce from processing facilities in Oregon, bound for health food distribution centers throughout the Southeast. Premium freight that paid well because of the strict temperature requirements and delivery, deadlines that left no room for delays or equipment failures. Our customer was a national chain that specialized in organic products with a reputation for quality control that made them desirable accounts for professional drivers. Doug Patterson had been my driving partner for 8 years, a methodical man who approached trucking like a science experiment, checking every detail twice and maintaining records that would impress federal auditors. At 59 years old, he'd survived 4 decades in the industry by never taking shortcuts that might compromise our safety, our cargo, or our professional reputation. We arrived at the Meridian facility at 11:15 p.m., during the third shift when most loading operations were winding down for the night. The dock supervisor, a nervous-looking man named Wayne, who kept checking his watch and glancing toward the office windows, seemed unusually eager to get us loaded and on our way. "Trailer's already loaded and sealed," Wayne explained, handing us the paperwork without making eye contact. "Temperature been maintained at -15 degrees since loading completed 6 hours ago. Customer is extremely particular about the cold chain. Don't open those doors until you reach your final destination in Atlanta." Standard instructions for high-value frozen produce, nothing that seemed unusual at the time. Doug and I performed our coupling procedures with the mechanical precision that comes from years of partnership, checking air lines, electrical connections, and the refrigeration unit that would maintain temperature during our Tono 200-mile journey across the country. The first indication that something was wrong came approximately 60 meters into our run, when Doug noticed an unusual odor seeping into our cab despite the sealed trailer and functioning climate control. Not the typical smell of refrigerated vegetables, but something organic and disturbing that made both of us immediately nauseous. "You smell that?" Doug asked, adjusting the ventilation system in our cab and checking the mirrors for any sign of refrigeration failure. I cracked my window and immediately caught the scent, sweet and cloying like flowers that had been left in water too long, mixed with something metallic and sharp that triggered primitive alarm responses deep in my brain. The smell was definitely coming from our trailer, despite the supposedly sealed cargo area and properly functioning refrigeration equipment. By the time we reached our fuel stop in Little Rock, Arkansas, the odor had intensified to the point where we were both feeling physically ill. Doug suggested we inspect the refrigeration unit for mechanical failures that might have allowed the cargo to spoil, even though our monitoring systems showed the trailer maintaining proper temperature. The reefer unit was operating perfectly, holding -5 degrees exactly as programmed. But when Doug opened the small access port to check the interior temperature probe, A wave of that horrible smell nearly knocked us both to our knees. It was like opening a tomb that had been sealed for decades. "That's not frozen vegetables," Doug said, covering his nose and mouth with his shirt. "I've hauled enough produce over 40 years to know what spoiled food smells like. This is something completely different. We were contractually obligated not to break the trailer seal during transport, and violating that agreement would void our insurance coverage and probably cost us the contract. But the smell was getting progressively worse with each mile, and we were starting to worry about what we might be unknowingly transporting across state lines." At our next stop in Memphis, Doug made a decision that probably saved both our lives and our freedom. "I'm calling the customer to report a possible cargo contamination issue. If there's been temperature failure or product spoilage, they need to know before we reach Georgia." The phone numbers on our delivery instructions had been disconnected. The backup contact information led to automated messages saying the mailboxes were full. When Doug tried calling the shipping company that had arranged the load, we discovered their business license had been suspended 4 months earlier for unspecified violations. "Hank, we're hauling an illegal load for a company that doesn't exist," Doug said, his face pale in the truck stop lighting. "And whatever's in that trailer definitely isn't frozen vegetables." We made the decision to break the seal and examine our cargo despite the contractual restrictions and potential legal consequences. What we found inside that refrigerated trailer will haunt both of us for the rest of our lives and made us unwilling participants in a criminal enterprise that we hadn't even known existed. The trailer contained no frozen vegetables. Instead, it was filled with dozens of stainless steel containers, each one approximately the size of a large ice chest, all connected to a sophisticated life support system that maintained them at precisely controlled temperatures. Through viewing windows in the container lids, we could see human organs suspended in clear preservative fluids, hearts, livers, kidneys, and other organs we couldn't identify. But these weren't medical specimens or legitimate transplant organs. Many of the containers held multiple organs from what appeared to be the same individuals, complete sets that suggested the donors had been systematically harvested. Some containers held organs that were obviously diseased or damaged, suggesting they had been removed from people who weren't suitable medical donors. Most horrifying of all, several containers held organs that appeared to be still functioning, hearts that were beating slowly in their preservation fluid, kidneys that were still filtering solutions through sophisticated tubes, livers that were processing nutrients pumped through external circulation systems. The technology was far beyond anything used in legitimate medical facilities. Doug immediately called 911 while I documented everything with my phone camera, though the images were so disturbing that I could barely look at them through the viewfinder. FBI agents arrived within 3 hours, followed by specialists from multiple federal agencies who treated our truck as a crime scene and us as potential suspects until our story was verified through polygraph tests and extensive background checks. The investigation revealed that we had unknowingly become part of an international organ trafficking network that had been using legitimate trucking companies to transport their products across the country for over a decade. The organs had been harvested from victims of human trafficking operations based in several major cities throughout the Pacific Northwest. Special Agent Rita Morrison, who led the federal task force investigating organ trafficking, explained that the criminal organization had been using sophisticated preservation technology to keep harvested organs viable for weeks or even months. "This isn't simple black market medical trade," she told us. "This is systematic murder for profit using victims who were specifically selected for their organ compatibility." The victims, Agent Morrison explained, had been homeless individuals, illegal immigrants, and runaway teenagers who wouldn't be missed by law enforcement or social services. They had been kept alive in medical facilities disguised as charitable clinics while their health was monitored and their organs were evaluated for potential buyers. What made the case particularly horrifying was the discovery that the preservation technology allowed multiple organs to be harvested from living victims over extended periods. The criminals had developed techniques for removing non-essential organs first, then keeping the victims alive while their remaining organs were monitored for optimal harvest timing. They were treating human beings like livestock, Agent Morrison said, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. The victims were kept alive in basement medical facilities while their organs were harvested one by one. Some of them survived for months in these conditions, The FBI investigation uncovered a network of fake medical clinics operating throughout the Pacific Northwest, each one equipped with surgical facilities that rivaled legitimate hospitals. The clinics advertised free healthcare services to homeless populations and undocumented immigrants, using these charitable facades to identify potential victims with healthy organs. Doug and I were cleared of any wrongdoing after extensive investigation, but the experience left both of us permanently traumatized. We couldn't stop thinking about the people who had been tortured and murdered for their organs, and the knowledge that we had been unknowingly transporting the evidence of their suffering across multiple state lines made us both physically sick for weeks. The worst discovery came during the trial of the trafficking ring's leaders, when we learned that the preservation systems in our trailer had been designed to keep the organs alive and functioning indefinitely. Some of the hearts we had seen beating in their containers had been removed from victims who had still been conscious during the harvest procedures. Agent Morrison testified that the criminal organization had been refining their techniques for over 15 years, developing increasingly sophisticated methods for keeping both victims and harvested organs alive for extended periods. They weren't just killing people for their organs, she explained to the court. They were perfecting techniques for prolonged torture that maximized the number of organs they could harvest from each victim. Doug quit trucking entirely after the trial concluded. He couldn't handle the uncertainty of not knowing what was really in any trailer. The possibility that any routine load might contain evidence of human trafficking or worse crimes. He moved back to his hometown in Iowa and took a job at a local hardware store, but he still wakes up screaming from nightmares about those beating hearts in their preservation containers. I continued driving, but I completely changed my approach to freight selection. I now personally verify every shipper and consignee, refuse loads with unusual restrictions or temperature requirements that can't be fully explained, and never haul for companies that I can't visit and inspect myself. I've turned down thousands of dollars in freight because something didn't feel right about the cargo or the customer. The trailer we had unknowingly transported was traced back to a network of facilities that were supposed to be legitimate medical research centers, but were actually fronts for the largest organ trafficking operation in American history. Over 200 people were arrested in coordinated raids across 12 states, but Agent Morrison warned us that similar operations were still active throughout the country. The freight industry is built on trust and efficiency, she explained during our debriefing sessions. Most truckers assume that what they're told about their cargo is accurate because the system depends on that trust. Criminal organizations exploit that assumption to move illegal products across state and international borders. 6 months after our horrifying discovery, Doug called me with news that made both of us question whether we had really escaped the organ trafficking network's influence. He had received a medical diagnosis that required immediate intervention, kidney failure that had developed rapidly despite his previous excellent health and no family history of renal disease. "Hank, what if they didn't just use us to transport organs?" Doug asked during our phone conversation, his voice hollow with fear. "What if being exposed to those preservation chemicals did something to us? What if we're going to need the kind of organs we were unknowingly carrying?" I've had my own health issues since that November night. Persistent respiratory problems that no doctor can fully explain, blood test results that show unusual enzyme levels, and recurring infections that suggest my immune system has been compromised. 3 other drivers who had unknowingly transported organ trafficking loads have developed similar health problems, all within 2 years of their exposure. Agent Morrison confirmed our suspicions during a follow-up interview. The preservation chemicals used by this organization were experimental compounds that haven't been approved for human exposure. We don't know what the long-term effects might be, but early indicators suggest they may cause accelerated organ deterioration in people who were exposed to them. The medical monitoring program established for drivers who had been exposed to the trafficking network's chemicals has revealed disturbing patterns. Nearly 60% of exposed drivers have developed health problems that specifically affect the organs that were being harvested and preserved in their trailers. It's as if the chemicals were designed not just to preserve stolen organs, but to damage the same organs in anyone who came into contact with them. Doug's kidney failure progressed rapidly despite aggressive treatment, and he was placed on the transplant waiting list within 8 months of our discovery. The cruel irony wasn't lost on either of us. We had unknowingly transported kidneys that could have saved his life, but those organs had been stolen from murder victims and were being sold to wealthy buyers who didn't ask questions about their source. The psychological counseling provided by the FBI helped us process the trauma of our discovery, but it couldn't address the deeper horror of knowing that we had been unwitting participants in systematic murder. Dr. Patricia Kellerman, our assigned therapist, explained that drivers in our situation often developed a form of survivor guilt, combined with persistent anxiety about the cargo they were carrying. "You both did everything right," Dr. Kellerman reminded us repeatedly. "You followed proper procedures, reported suspicious circumstances, and cooperated fully with law enforcement. The criminals who exploited your professionalism are responsible for these crimes, not the drivers who were deceived into transporting their products." But her reassurances couldn't eliminate the nightmares that still plague both of us. Doug dreams about those beating hearts every night, while I wake up in cold sweats, thinking about the victims who died so their organs could be sold to buyers who treated human body parts like luxury commodities. The trial of the organ trafficking ring's leaders provided some measure of justice, but it also revealed the full scope of their operations. Over 300 victims had been murdered during the 15 years the organization had been active. Their organs sold for a total of more than $50 million to buyers throughout the United States and international markets. The buyers included wealthy individuals who needed transplants but didn't want to wait for legitimate donor organs, medical facilities that were performing illegal transplant procedures, and research organizations that were conducting experiments that would never be approved by ethical review boards. Many of the buyers knew exactly what they were purchasing, making them accessories to multiple murders. Most disturbing was the revelation that the trafficking network had been expanding their operations to include other forms of human experimentation. The preservation technology they had developed for organs was being adapted to keep entire human subjects alive during extended medical procedures that were designed to test experimental treatments and surgical techniques. Agent Morrison's final report on the case included recommendations for enhanced cargo screening procedures and mandatory verification systems for medical freight. But she acknowledged that determined criminals would always find ways to exploit the trucking industry's reliance on trust and efficiency. As long as there's a market for human organs and experimental subjects, there will be criminals willing to supply that market. She concluded the best protection for legitimate drivers is education about the warning signs and the courage to report suspicious circumstances even when it might cost them a valuable contract. The Meridian Distribution Center was closed permanently after the investigation revealed that its management had been paid to facilitate the organ trafficking operation. The facility's loading docks had been modified with specialized equipment for maintaining the preservation systems used to keep harvested organs alive during transport. Other distribution centers throughout the Pacific Northwest were investigated, and several were found to have similar modifications, suggesting that the organ trafficking network had been far more extensive than initially believed. The FBI estimates that hundreds of legitimate truckers had unknowingly transported trafficking victims or their organs over the years, making the entire industry complicit in crimes they never knew they were committing. Today, I approach every loading dock with suspicion, especially facilities that handle medical freight or operate during unusual hours. I've learned to recognize the signs that indicate a shipment might not be what it appears to be. Unusual temperature requirements, excessive security measures, paperwork that doesn't match standard industry practices, and customers who can't be independently verified. The Oregon trafficking case taught me that evil often hides behind legitimate business facades, and that criminals deliberately target honest people whose trustworthiness can be exploited to transport evidence of their crimes. The trucking industry's emphasis on efficiency and schedule compliance creates vulnerabilities that sophisticated criminal organizations can exploit to move illegal products across vast distances. Doug never received his kidney transplant. He died 18 months after our discovery, his health destroyed by exposure to chemicals that had been designed to preserve organs stolen from murder victims. At his funeral, Agent Morrison told me that he was essentially the last victim of the organ trafficking ring we had helped expose. The chemicals that killed Doug were the same ones that kept those stolen organs alive, she said. In a very real sense, he died from the same crimes that killed the people whose organs you were transporting. The only difference is that his death took longer. I continue to drive, but every trailer I haul is a reminder of the horror we discovered at that loading dock in Oregon. I've become an advocate for enhanced cargo screening and verification procedures, speaking at industry conferences about the importance of knowing what you're really transporting across America's highways. The loading dock at Meridian Distribution Center has been demolished, but the memories of what we found there will never be erased. Sometimes in my darkest moments, I can still smell that sweet cloying odor that first alerted us to the presence of death in our trailer. And sometimes when I'm checking my cargo at loading docks throughout the country, I remember those beating hearts and wonder what horrors might be hiding behind the next bill of lading. The lesson I learned from our discovery is simple but terrifying. Not all cargo is what it appears to be, and sometimes the most evil crimes hide behind the most innocent-looking paperwork. Every loading dock is a potential crime scene, and every trailer might contain evidence of horrors that most people can't even imagine. The organ trafficking ring we exposed was just one criminal organization exploiting the trucking industry's trust-based system. Agent Morrison estimates that dozens of similar operations are still active throughout the country, using legitimate drivers to transport everything from human trafficking victims to experimental medical subjects to biological weapons. The highways of America carry more than just legal cargo, she warned me during our final interview, and sometimes the most dangerous loads are the ones that look completely normal on paper. That's why I check every trailer now, regardless of seals or contractual restrictions. Because sometimes the most important thing a trucker can do is refuse to transport cargo that might be evidence of crimes against humanity. Even when refusing means losing money or damaging professional relationships. The dead deserve justice, and the living deserve protection from the criminals who exploit our highways to transport the evidence of their crimes. Sometimes that protection depends on drivers who are brave enough to break seals and ask uncomfortable questions, even when the answers might destroy their peace of mind forever. Interstate 80 through Nebraska is supposed to be one of the safest highways in America for a trucker in distress. I'm Carl Brennan, been pulling freight for 28 years. And I always figured that if I broke down on a major interstate, help would arrive quickly from other drivers or state patrol. But what happened when my rig died in the breakdown lane near North Platte taught me that sometimes the people who stop to help have darker intentions than highway assistance. My 2017 Volvo VNL had been running perfectly until 3:17 a.m. on that October morning, when every warning light on my dashboard illuminated simultaneously and my engine shut down with the finality of a heart attack. No gradual loss of power, no unusual noises, no preliminary symptoms. One moment I was cruising at 65 with a load of agricultural equipment bound for Colorado, and the next I was coasting to a stop with a completely dead truck. I've experienced mechanical failures before, but this was different. Every system had failed simultaneously in a way that didn't make mechanical sense. Engine, transmission, electrical, even my air brakes had dumped pressure for no apparent reason. My cell phone showed full signal strength, but every call I attempted failed to connect. 911, my dispatcher, roadside assistance. None would go through despite perfect network coverage. My CB radio produced only static, unusual for a major interstate, that normally carried steady chatter from other drivers. I was stranded in complete isolation on one of America's busiest freight corridors, unable to communicate despite being surrounded by technology that should have connected me to help within minutes. That's when I saw the headlights approaching from behind. A pickup truck moving slowly along the shoulder, like the driver was looking for someone who needed assistance. In the trucking community, we call these people highway angels. Good Samaritans who stop to help stranded motorists. The vehicle that stopped behind my trailer was a well-maintained pickup that looked maybe 10 years old. Nothing unusual about it. The driver who climbed out was a man in his 50s, wearing work sea clothes and carrying what appeared to be a professional toolbox. "Looks like you're having some trouble," he called out as he approached my cab. "Name's Keith Morrison. I was just heading home from a service call when I spotted your flashers. Mind if I take a look under your hood?" Keith had the confident demeanor of someone who had spent decades working on vehicles, and his offer seemed genuine enough. His pickup showed no obvious signs that would make me suspicious. No damage, proper license plates, emergency flashers activated while parked behind my truck. Engine just died completely, I explained, grateful for any help despite the late hour. All systems failed at the same time, which doesn't make sense mechanically. Keith nodded knowingly as he opened my hood and began examining my engine with a powerful flashlight. Seen this before on newer trucks. Sometimes it's electrical, sometimes it's fuel delivery. Let me check a few things. His diagnosis seemed professional enough, and he worked with practiced efficiency, checking connections and testing components. But as he worked, I began to notice details that made me uneasy. Keith's toolbox contained equipment I didn't recognize, devices that looked more medical than mechanical, with sharp edges and strange attachments. When I asked about them, he explained they were specialized diagnostic tools for modern truck systems. Try starting her up now, Keith called after about 20 minutes of work under my hood. I turned the key and was amazed when my Volvo started immediately. All systems functioning normally. But something about Keith's demeanor had changed. He seemed less helpful now, more calculating, like he was studying me rather than just providing roadside assistance. "How did you fix it so quickly?" I asked. "Climbing down from my cab to thank him. Just disconnected and reconnected a few things," Keith replied. But his eyes were scanning my truck's cargo area with unusual interest. "Say, what are you hauling?" Agricultural equipment can be valuable stuff. The question set off alarm bells in my head. Legitimate Good Samaritans don't typically ask about cargo values, and Keith's interest seemed too focused on the commercial aspects of my load rather than just being helpful. "Standard farm machinery," I replied carefully, not providing specific details. Nothing too exciting. Keith's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mind if I take a look? I've got a farm operation myself. Always interested in seeing new equipment. No legitimate. Mechanic needs to inspect cargo to fix engine problems." Keith was fishing for information about my load, probably assessing whether it was worth stealing. I started backing toward my cab, but Keith moved to block my path. "You know, Carl, I saw your name on the truck registration. You're in a pretty isolated spot out here. Nearest help is probably 50 meters in either direction. A lot of things can happen to a driver on a lonely stretch of highway." The friendly demeanor was gone now, replaced by something that made my blood run cold. Keith wasn't a good Samaritan. He was a predator who used breakdown situations to target vulnerable drivers. "I need to get back on the road," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while moving toward my cab. "Thanks for the help. I don't think you understand," Keith said, his voice taking on a threatening tone. "This stretch of highway has seen a lot of accidents over the years. Drivers who get careless, who don't appreciate the help they receive. That's when I saw the gun." Keith had pulled it from his toolbox while pretending to put his equipment away. He held it casually, like it was just another tool for dealing with stranded truckers. "Here's how this works," Keith continued, his voice now completely cold and professional. "You're going to open that trailer and show me what you're carrying. Then we're going to discuss how much it's worth and how much you're willing to pay to continue your journey." I realized I had walked into a hijacking operation. Keith wasn't a random Good Samaritan. He was part of an organized crew that targeted isolated truckers using fake breakdowns or actual mechanical sabotage to create opportunities for cargo theft. "The engine problems weren't random, were they?" I asked, stalling for time while trying to figure out how to escape. Keith laughed. "Electromagnetic pulse device knocks out all the electronic systems in newer trucks without causing permanent damage. Makes drivers think they've had a catastrophic failure when really they just need someone to reset their computers. The sophisticated equipment, the professional approach, the knowledge of truck systems." Keith was part of a criminal organization that had perfected the art of highway robbery using modern technology and fake Good Samaritan tactics. "How many drivers have you done this to?" I asked. "Enough to make a good living," Keith replied. "Amazing how trusting truckers are when they think they're getting help from a fellow traveler. Most drivers are so grateful for assistance that they never suspect the person helping them is the one who caused their problems." Keith explained the operation while keeping his gun trained on me. His crew had been targeting commercial vehicles on isolated stretches of interstate for over 3 years, using EMP devices to disable trucks and then posing as helpful mechanics to gain access to cargo. "We researched the loads ahead of time," Keith said. "Track valuable shipments through dispatch communications. Follow trucks to isolated areas. then create the breakdown situation. Drivers call for help, but their communications are jammed. Then we show up as the solution to their problem. The communication jamming explained why my phone and radio hadn't worked. Keith's crew was using professional-grade equipment to isolate their targets, ensuring that victims couldn't call for legitimate help while the robbery was in progress. Most drivers cooperate once they understand the situation, Keith continued. We take what we want from the cargo. The driver continues his delivery with a story about highway mechanical failure, and everyone goes home alive. But some drivers get difficult, start thinking they're heroes. I could see where this was heading. Keith was describing a choice between cooperation and something much worse. But I also noticed that he was standing between his pickup and my truck, blocking my view of anything that might be approaching on the highway. That's when I heard the diesel engine. Keith heard it too, and his relaxed demeanor changed immediately. Another truck was approaching on the highway, and its driver would see the breakdown situation and possibly stop to offer assistance. Keith's operation depended on isolation and control. Unexpected witnesses were a major problem. Get in your cab and act normal, Keith hissed, concealing his weapon. One word about what's happening here, and you'll regret it. The approaching truck was a Peterbilt pulling a reefer trailer, probably another driver making an overnight run through Nebraska. As it passed our location, the driver hit his air horn twice. The universal trucker signal acknowledging a breakdown and asking if help was needed. I had a split second to make a decision that would determine whether I lived or died. Keith expected me to wave off the other driver, maintaining the illusion that everything was under control. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and began signaling SOS. 3 short flashes, 3 long flashes, 3 short flashes. The Peterbilt's brake lights immediately illuminated as the driver began slowing down. Keith realized what was happening and started moving toward his pickup, probably to retrieve additional weapons or communication equipment. I ran for my cab, fired up my diesel, and floored it, despite not having completed proper startup procedures. My Volvo lurched forward with the grinding protest of an engine that hadn't been properly warmed, but it moved fast enough to get me away from Keith's position. In my mirrors, I could see Keith scrambling into his pickup while the Peterbilt driver was pulling over to investigate the situation. The other trucker had no idea he was driving into a robbery in progress, but his presence had given me the opportunity I needed to escape. I grabbed my CB radio as soon as I was clear of whatever jamming equipment Keith was using. Mayday, mayday. This is Cornhusker Express eastbound on I-80 near mile marker 126. Armed robbery in progress. Other driver in immediate danger. Need immediate law enforcement response. The radio exploded with responses from multiple drivers who had heard my transmission. Within minutes, the highway was buzzing with truckers coordinating to surround Keith's position and protect the Peterbilt driver, who had unknowingly intervened in the robbery. Nebraska State Patrol arrived 20 minutes later to find Keith in custody, held by a group of truckers who had responded to my distress call. His pickup contained enough evidence to link him to dozens of similar robberies throughout the Midwest. EMP devices, communication jammers, weapons, and detailed information about high-value cargo shipments. The investigation that followed revealed that Keith Morrison was part of a sophisticated highway robbery ring that had been operating for over 5 years. They used legitimate-seeming roadside assistance to target commercial vehicles carrying valuable cargo, stealing millions of dollars worth of freight while rarely being detected. Most victims never realized they were being robbed, explained Agent Rita Morrison from the FBI's Cargo Theft Task Force. The criminals would take portions of loads rather than entire shipments, and drivers would assume they'd miscounted or that weight discrepancies were due to measurement errors. Keith's crew had perfected their operation to minimize detection and victim resistance. They appeared helpful rather than threatening, used technology that created believable mechanical failures, and took only enough cargo to be profitable without triggering major investigations. The trucking industry's Good Samaritan culture made this operation possible. Agent Morrison continued, "Drivers are trained to help each other, to trust people who offer assistance during breakdowns. These criminals exploited that trust to gain access to millions of dollars worth of cargo. The EMP devices Keith's crew used were military-grade equipment that had been stolen from defense contractors. The communication jamming technology was sophisticated enough to block multiple frequencies simultaneously, creating dead zones where victims couldn't call for help. This wasn't random highway crime. Agent Morrison explained this was organized theft that used inside information to target specific loads, planned routes to identify optimal robbery locations, and professional equipment to execute complex operations. Keith Morrison was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, but the investigation revealed that similar operations were active throughout the country. Highway robbery had evolved from simple armed theft to sophisticated criminal enterprises that used technology and psychology to maximize profit while minimizing risk. The Peterbilt driver, who had unknowingly saved my life, became a hero in the trucking community. But he admitted that he'd had no idea what he was driving into when he stopped to check on my situation. "I just saw a breakdown and wanted to help," he told investigators. "In this business, we look out for each other. Never occurred to me that someone might be using that against us." The experience changed how I approach breakdown situations and roadside assistance. I now carry multiple communication devices to ensure I can call for help, even if some systems are jammed. And I'm suspicious of Good Samaritans who ask too many questions about my cargo. Most importantly, I learned that the people who seem most helpful might be the most dangerous. Keith Morrison had perfected the appearance of a legitimate roadside mechanic, but his real business was highway robbery disguised as humanitarian assistance. The trucking industry has implemented new protocols for dealing with breakdown situations and suspicious roadside assistance. Drivers are encouraged to verify the identity of anyone offering help and to be suspicious of assistance that seems too convenient or professional. The best protection is communication. Agent Morrison advised, "Stay in contact with dispatch. Use multiple radio channels to report your situation, and never assume that someone offering help has legitimate intentions." Highway robbery continues to evolve as criminals develop new technologies and tactics for targeting commercial vehicles. The Good Samaritan approach used by Keith's crew has been adopted by other criminal organizations throughout the country, making every breakdown situation a potential robbery opportunity. Today, when I experience mechanical problems, I'm careful about who I accept help from and suspicious of anyone who seems too interested in my cargo. Keith Morrison taught me that the most dangerous criminals are often the ones who appear most helpful, and that highway assistance can be a weapon used against the very drivers it's supposed to protect. The breakdown lane isn't just a place where disabled vehicles wait for assistance. It's a hunting ground where predators use our community's culture of mutual aid against us. Keith Morrison's operation was stopped, but similar criminals continue to exploit the trust that makes the trucking community strong. Every professional driver should understand that we're targets for criminals who understand our routes, our schedules, and our willingness to help each other. The person who stops to offer assistance might be a genuine Good Samaritan, or they might be someone who sees stranded truckers as opportunities for profit. The electromagnetic pulse device that Keith used to disable my truck was eventually traced back to a theft from a military research facility. Similar devices are now being used by criminal organizations throughout the country to create artificial breakdown situations that allow them to target specific drivers and cargo. Highway robbery has become a high-tech crime. Agent Morrison warned criminals are using sophisticated equipment and inside information to create situations where drivers become vulnerable to theft, kidnapping, or worse. The Nebraska State Patrol now maintains special units that monitor for signs of organized highway crime. But the vastness of America's interstate system makes it impossible to protect every vulnerable driver. The best protection remains vigilance, communication, and healthy suspicion of assistance that seems too good to be true. Keith Morrison's fake Good Samaritan operation continues to serve as a warning that not all roadside assistance comes from legitimate sources. Sometimes the person who stops to help is actually the person who caused your problems, and the solution they offer might be worse than the breakdown you're experiencing. The highway brotherhood that brings truckers together for mutual assistance also makes us vulnerable to predators who understand our culture and use it against us. The real horror isn't supernatural forces or ghostly mechanics. It's the very human evil that disguises itself as help while planning to harm the very people it claims to assist. But the trucking community's response to Keith's operation proved that our mutual aid culture is stronger than the criminals who try to exploit it. When I called for help, dozens of drivers responded immediately, surrounding Keith's position and protecting the innocent driver who had unknowingly intervened in the robbery. That response gives me hope that the good in our community outweighs the evil that tries to use our trust against us. But it also reminds me that vigilance is the price of safety on America's highways, and that the most dangerous predators are often the ones who appear most helpful. Keith Morrison is in prison, but his methods have been copied by criminal organizations throughout the country. Every breakdown situation is now a potential encounter with criminals who use roadside assistance as a weapon against the drivers they claim to help. The breakdown lane remains a place where help and harm look exactly the same, and where the difference between salvation and destruction might be nothing more than a trucker's willingness to signal for help when something doesn't feel right. Sometimes the most dangerous person on the highway is the one who stops to offer assistance. Keith Morrison taught me that lesson the hard way, and it's one that every professional driver needs to understand before they find themselves stranded in the breakdown lane with someone whose intentions aren't as helpful as they appear. Running in convoy with other truckers is supposed to be one of the safest ways to travel America's highways, especially during overnight hours when traffic is light and the risk of accidents increases. I'm Bobby Mitchell, been driving for 21 years, and I've always found comfort in the shared communication and mutual assistance that comes from traveling with other professional drivers. But what happened during a convoy run through Wyoming last winter taught me that sometimes the drivers who invite you to join their group aren't hauling legitimate freight. The convoy formed at the truck stop in Laram, as often happens when several drivers are heading the same direction with similar schedules. 5 trucks total, all pulling for what appeared to be different companies, but united by the common destination of Salt Lake City and the treacherous mountain roads that lay between Wyoming and Utah during winter conditions. Leading the convoy was Rita Gonzalez in a sharp-looking Kenworth, a woman who claimed 30 years of experience and seemed to know the mountain routes better than most locals. Behind her came Vernon Walsh in a Peterbilt that looked expensive but somehow too clean for a working truck, followed by myself in my trusty Freightliner. Then Marvin Tucker in a Mack that was older but obviously well-maintained. And finally Nancy Edwards bringing up the rear in a Volvo that seemed inconsistent with the type of loads she claimed to haul. We established communication on Channel 19 and agreed to maintain visual contact throughout the journey, providing updates on road conditions, weather changes, and any hazards that might affect the group's safety. Standard convoy protocol that had served the trucking community well for decades or so, I thought. The weather forecast called for light snow with good visibility, conditions that were manageable for experienced drivers operating well-maintained equipment. Interstate 80 through Wyoming was notorious for sudden weather changes that could transform routine trips into survival situations. But our convoy included drivers who claimed the experience and equipment necessary to handle whatever nature might throw at us. We departed Laram at 11:30 p.m., heading west into a clear night with stars visible through scattered clouds. Radio chatter was professional but somehow different from normal convoy communications. These drivers knew each other too well, used terminology that seemed coded, and discussed routes with a precision that suggested they'd traveled together many times before. "Looking good ahead, convoy." Rita called back from her lead position as we climbed toward the Continental Divide. Roads clear, no smokies in sight, and our schedules holding tight. Everyone maintain discipline and stay sharp. The reference to discipline struck me as odd. Professional drivers talked about safety and caution, but military-style discipline wasn't typical trucking terminology. I began paying closer attention to the convoy's behavior and communication patterns. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when I noticed that all the other trucks had modified exhaust systems that seemed designed to minimize noise rather than maximize performance. Their CB radios used frequencies and terminology that weren't standard for commercial drivers, and their equipment showed signs of customization that went far beyond normal trucking accessories. "Convoy, this is Bobby in the Freightliner," called, testing their responses. "I'm showing some temperature variations on my engine. Mind if I drop back and check things out?" Rita's response came immediately with an edge that hadn't been there before. "Negative, Bobby. Maintain position and stay with the group. We don't make unscheduled stops on this route. Whatever your problem is, it can wait until we reach our destination." No legitimate convoy leader would refuse to allow a driver to address potential mechanical problems. Safety always took priority over schedules in professional trucking operations. Rita's insistence that I maintain position regardless of equipment concerns was a red flag that suggested this convoy operated under different rules than normal commercial freight. As we continued west, I began noticing details about my convoy partners that didn't match their claims of being independent owner-operators hauling standard freight. Their trucks were too well maintained for the rough work they described. Their equipment was too expensive for the rates they claimed to earn, and their coordination was too precise for drivers who supposedly met randomly at truck stops. "Bobby, you seem nervous back there," Vernon called over the radio, his voice carrying a subtle threat. "Something bothering you about our little group?" The fact that he'd noticed my increased attention to their activities suggested they were monitoring me more closely than normal convoy partners would. Professional drivers focused on the road ahead and their own equipment, not on studying other members of their group with the intensity these people were showing. "Just being cautious," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Long hauls can be unpredictable, especially in winter conditions." "Indeed they can," Marvin chimed in from his position behind me. "That's why it's important to trust your convoy partners and follow established procedures. Drivers who ask too many questions or break formation can create problems for everyone." The veiled threat was unmistakable. This wasn't a conversation between independent truckers. It was a warning from people who operated as a unit and expected compliance from anyone who joined their group. I began to suspect that I had unknowingly joined a convoy that was involved in illegal activities. At mile marker 323, Rita directed the convoy to take an exit that led away from Interstate 80 toward a route I didn't recognize. When I questioned the deviation from our planned path, she explained that they were avoiding a way station that had been problematic for their operations. "County Mounties have been hassling legitimate drivers all week," Rita said, though her explanation didn't match current law enforcement patterns in the area. "We use an alternate route that avoids unnecessary delays and inspections. Professional drivers avoided way stations when they were running illegal loads or operating equipment that wouldn't pass safety inspections." Rita's insistence on bypassing official checkpoints confirmed my growing suspicion that this convoy was transporting something that couldn't withstand scrutiny from law enforcement. The alternate route led through increasingly remote terrain along highways that were barely maintained and rarely patrolled. As we climbed into mountainous country, I noticed that the other trucks began changing their formation, with Vernon and Marvin positioning themselves to block any attempt I might make to turn around or take a different route. "Where exactly are we going?" I asked over the radio, no longer trying to hide my concern. "Patience, Bobby," Nancy replied from her rear position. "We're taking a scenic route that provides better security for valuable cargo. Some loads require special handling and discretion." The mention of valuable cargo and special handling sent alarm bells through my head. Combined with the convoy's military-style coordination, modified equipment, and insistence on avoiding official checkpoints, it suggested that I had joined a group involved in smuggling operations. At mile marker 45 on the remote highway we were following, Rita led the convoy to an unmarked facility that appeared to be some kind of transfer station. Multiple trucks were already parked there, along with several SUVs and pickup trucks that looked like they belonged to security personnel rather than truck drivers. "Bobby, you're going to park in Bay 7 and wait for instructions," Rita commanded, her friendly demeanor completely gone. "Don't exit your vehicle, don't use your radio, and don't ask questions. This is a routine cargo transfer, and your cooperation will ensure everything goes smoothly." I realized I had driven into a major smuggling operation that used legitimate-looking convoys to transport illegal materials across state lines. The facility was clearly designed for transferring cargo between trucks without creating paper trails or official records that could be traced by law enforcement. "What if I want to leave?" I asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't. Rita's laugh was cold and professional. "Bobby, you joined our convoy voluntarily, and you've seen our operation. Leaving isn't really an option anymore. But don't worry. As long as you follow orders and keep your mouth shut, you'll be compensated for your cooperation." That's when I saw the armed guards, men in tactical gear who were positioned around the facility, obviously there to ensure that unwilling participants in the smuggling operation didn't have opportunities to escape or contact law enforcement. This wasn't just cargo transfer. It was a criminal enterprise that used kidnapping and intimidation to maintain security. Vernon appeared at my driver's side window, no longer pretending to be a friendly convoy partner. "Bobby, you're going to back into Bay 7 and help transfer some special packages from your trailer to another truck. The packages are valuable, delicate, and none of your business. Ask no questions, cause no problems, and everyone goes home safely." I had no choice but to comply. My trailer was unloaded by teams of workers who moved with military precision, transferring packages that were obviously much more valuable and dangerous than the consumer electronics I thought I was hauling. The packages were small, heavy, and handled with extreme care that suggested drugs, weapons, or other contraband. "What was really in my trailer?" I asked Vernon during the transfer process. "Components for special electronic systems," he replied, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say that certain governments are very interested in American technology, and some companies are willing to provide that technology through unofficial channels. I was part of an international smuggling operation that used legitimate trucking companies to transport restricted technology to foreign buyers. My consumer electronics had actually been components for military or intelligence systems that were supposed to be protected by export controls and national security regulations. The transfer took 3 hours, during which I was closely guarded and not allowed to communicate with anyone outside the facility. When it was complete, my trailer was loaded with different cargo packages that looked identical to what had been removed, but which I suspected contained entirely different materials. "Bobby, you're going to complete your original delivery route to Salt Lake City," Rita explained as the convoy prepared to leave the transfer facility. "Your new cargo is legitimate consumer electronics that will pass any inspection. Your paperwork matches the load and everything is completely legal." "What about what I saw here?" I asked. "You stopped at a truck stop for fuel and rest," Rita replied, matter-of-factly. "Nothing unusual happened, no unusual cargo was involved, and you have no knowledge of any activities that might interest law enforcement. Some knowledge is dangerous, Bobby. Much safer to forget things that don't concern you." The threat was clear. My silence was required for my continued safety, and the smuggling operation had procedures for dealing with drivers who might become problems. I was now a participant in international crime, whether I wanted to be or not. The convoy resumed its journey toward Salt Lake City, but the dynamic had completely changed. I was no longer a voluntary participant. I was a prisoner traveling under guard toward a destination where my fate would be determined by people who treated human life as just another business expense. During the remaining drive, Vernon explained how the operation worked. Legitimate. Trucking companies were infiltrated by smuggling networks that used their drivers and equipment to transport illegal materials. Most drivers never knew what they were really carrying, but those who discovered the truth were forced to choose between cooperation and disappearance. "We prefer cooperation," Vernon said. "Drivers who work with us are well compensated and protected. Those who cause problems, well, trucking is a dangerous profession. Accidents happen all the time on America's highways." The implication was clear. Drivers who threatened the operation's security were eliminated, their deaths disguised as highway accidents or mechanical failures that left no evidence of criminal activity. When we reached Salt Lake City, I was taken to a warehouse where I met the operations leadership. They offered me a choice: become a regular participant in their smuggling network, earning substantial payments for hauling restricted materials, or refuse and face the consequences of my knowledge about their activities. "We need drivers with clean records and legitimate equipment," explained the man who introduced himself as the operations coordinator. "You've proven you can handle the work, and your background check shows you're reliable and professional. Join our team, and you'll earn more in a month than most truckers make in a year." The alternative to cooperation wasn't explicitly stated, but the presence of armed security and the remote location of the warehouse made it clear that refusal would be permanent. I agreed to participate, but spent the following weeks planning my escape from the smuggling network. The FBI field office in Denver became my lifeline when I finally worked up the courage to contact them, leading to an 18-month undercover operation that ultimately dismantled one of the largest technology smuggling rings in American history. The investigation revealed that the network had been operating for over 8 years, using legitimate trucking companies to transport restricted materials to buyers in China, Russia, and other countries that were prohibited from acquiring advanced American technology. Hundreds of drivers had been either recruited or coerced into participating, creating a transportation system that moved billions of dollars worth of illegal exports. Rita, Vernon, Marvin, and Nancy were all arrested during coordinated raids that seized trucks, cargo, and facilities throughout the western United States. The transfer station, where I had witnessed the cargo exchange, was revealed to be one of dozens of similar facilities operating along major freight corridors. This operation represents one of the most sophisticated technology theft schemes we've ever encountered, explained Agent Patricia Morrison, who led the FBI's investigation. They were stealing American military and intelligence technology and selling it to foreign governments that could use it against our own forces. My testimony helped convict over 40 people involved in the smuggling network, but the experience left me permanently changed. I learned that the trucking industry's trust-based system made it vulnerable to infiltration by criminal organizations that could exploit honest drivers for illegal purposes. The convoy that had seemed like a routine group of professional drivers was actually a sophisticated criminal operation that used military-style coordination and intimidation to move restricted materials across international borders. My decision to join them for mutual safety had nearly made me a participant in crimes against my own country. Today, I'm much more careful about convoy invitations from drivers I don't know personally. The experience taught me that not all truckers are who they claim to be, and that some convoys are designed not for mutual protection, but for criminal activities that put all participants at risk. The smuggling network continues to operate in different forms throughout the country, using the trucking industry's culture of cooperation and mutual assistance to recruit unwitting participants in illegal activities. Every convoy invitation is now a potential encounter with criminals who see honest drivers as either assets to be exploited or threats to be eliminated. The wrong convoy taught me that the highway brotherhood can be used as a weapon by people who understand our culture, but have no respect for our values. Sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones who look exactly like legitimate professional drivers, and the safest convoys are often the ones you travel alone. Interstate 80 through Wyoming continues to carry both legitimate freight and illegal cargo moved by drivers who may not know which category their loads fall into. The transfer facilities used by smuggling networks are disguised as legitimate truck stops and service areas, making it impossible for honest drivers to distinguish between legal and illegal operations. But the convoy system that brings truckers together for mutual assistance also makes us vulnerable to criminals who use our trust and cooperation against us. The real horror isn't supernatural forces or ghostly convoys. It's the very human evil that disguises itself as professional camaraderie while planning to exploit or eliminate the drivers it claims to protect. My encounter with the wrong convoy serves as a warning that not all drivers who offer assistance have legitimate intentions, and that some convoys are designed to trap rather than protect the truckers who join them. The highway brotherhood is strong, but it's also vulnerable to predators who understand our culture and use it as a weapon against us. The smuggling operation I helped expose was just one of many criminal networks that use America's highways to transport illegal materials. And every convoy invitation is a potential encounter with criminals who see honest drivers as either tools to be used or threats to be eliminated. Sometimes the most dangerous convoy is the one that seems most professional, and the safest way to travel is to trust your instincts when something doesn't feel right about the drivers who invite you to join their group. The wrong convoy can turn a routine freight run into a criminal conspiracy that destroys everything you've worked to build over decades of honest driving. The transfer facility where I witnessed the cargo exchange has been demolished, but similar operations continue throughout the country, using legitimate-looking truck stops and service areas to conceal illegal activities that threaten both national security and the lives of unwitting drivers who stumble into their operations. Every professional driver should understand that we're targets for criminal organizations that need our equipment, our routes, and our reputations to move illegal materials across state and international borders. The convoy that seems most helpful might be the most dangerous, and the drivers who claim to offer protection might actually be the greatest threat we face on America's highways. My experience with the wrong convoy taught me that paranoia isn't a character flaw in the trucking industry. It's a survival skill that can mean the difference between completing a legitimate delivery and becoming an unwilling participant in crimes that could destroy your life and threaten your country's security. The highway brotherhood that makes trucking a community also makes us vulnerable to criminals who exploit our trust for illegal purposes. Sometimes the most important thing a driver can do is refuse convoy invitations that don't feel right, even when traveling alone seems more dangerous than joining a group that might not be what it appears to be. The Chrome Horse truck stop outside. Albuquerque looked like salvation when I spotted its neon signs at 2:43 a.m. on a cold December night. I'm Wayne Carter, been running freight for 24 years, and I know every legitimate truck stop between Los Angeles and Chicago, but I'd never seen the Chrome Horse before, despite traveling Interstate 40 through New Mexico hundreds of times during my career. The facility appeared to be a classic truck stop, multiple diesel islands, a restaurant advertising home cooking 24 hours, a shop promising parts and service. Exactly what I needed after 14 hours of driving with a load of electronics bound for Oklahoma City and fuel tanks running dangerously low. My Peterbilt's fuel gauge showed less than 30 gallons remaining in my twin tanks, barely enough to reach the next truck stop if my calculations were correct. The Chrome Horse couldn't have appeared at a better time, offering the fuel and services I needed to continue my run safely. But something felt wrong from the moment I pulled into the facility. The fuel islands were busy despite the late hour, with several trucks taking on diesel. But the drivers moved strangely, too quiet, too nervous, avoiding eye contact like people who didn't want to be recognized. The whole place had an atmosphere of fear that you could feel in the air. The pump attendant who approached my truck was a middle-aged man named Douglas, who seemed professional enough, but his eyes kept darting toward the main building like he was afraid of something inside. When he spoke, his voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold New Mexico air. "Evening, driver," Douglas said, beginning the fueling process with practiced efficiency. "Beautiful night for running freight. Where you headed?" "Oklahoma City," I replied, climbing down from my cab to stretch my legs. "Been on the road since noon yesterday. Looking forward to getting some rest after I make this delivery." Douglas nodded while monitoring the fuel flow, but I noticed he kept checking his watch and glancing toward the restaurant windows. "You might want to get your fuel and go," he said quietly, almost whispering. "This place, it's not what it seems." Before I could ask what he meant, a man in an expensive suit appeared beside my truck. He looked completely out of place at a truck stop. Too clean, too well-dressed, moving with the confidence of someone who owned everything he saw. "Wayne Carter," the man said, reading my name from my truck registration. "From Iowa, running electronics to Oklahoma City. Right on schedule." The fact that he knew my name and cargo details without me providing them set off every alarm bell in my head. Legitimate truck stop operators don't research their customers' personal information or shipping details. "How do you know my name?" I asked, instinctively moving closer to my cab. "We know a lot about our customers," the man replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Information is valuable in our business. Speaking of which, we have a proposition that might interest you." That's when I noticed the security cameras. They were everywhere, mounted on poles, hidden in signs, positioned to capture every angle of the facility. This wasn't normal truck stop security. This was surveillance equipment designed to monitor and record everything that happened on the property. "What kind of proposition?" I asked, though every instinct told me to get back in my truck and leave immediately. "Cargo transportation," the man said. "High-value loads that pay extremely well. Much better than electronics runs to Oklahoma City." I'd heard similar offers before from criminals who tried to recruit legitimate drivers for illegal operations. The fact that this man knew my current load details suggested he had access to shipping information that should have been confidential. "I'm not interested in illegal freight," I said, starting to back toward my truck. "Who said anything about illegal?" the man replied, his tone becoming more aggressive. "We operate legitimate transportation services for clients who value discretion and security." Douglas finished fueling my truck and approached with the receipt, but his hands were shaking as he handed me the paperwork. "That'll be $147, he said, but his eyes were pleading with me to just pay and leave. As I reached for my wallet, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Through the restaurant windows, I could see people sitting at tables, but they weren't truck drivers grabbing late-night meals. They were young women, maybe teenagers, all wearing similar clothes and sitting perfectly still like they were waiting for instructions. "What's going on in the restaurant?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Employee training," the man in the suit replied too quickly. "New staff orientation, very intensive program." But I could see that the young women weren't being trained for restaurant work. They looked terrified, malnourished, and completely under someone else's control. This wasn't staff training, it was human trafficking. I paid for my fuel in cash and started walking back to my truck, but the man in the suit followed me. "Wayne, you've seen our operation now. That creates a certain responsibility on your part." "What kind of responsibility?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The kind that requires ongoing cooperation," he replied. "Drivers who understand our business model tend to be very successful. Those who don't, well, they tend to have accidents on dangerous highways." The threat was clear. I had stumbled into a human trafficking operation that used the Chrome Horse truck stop as a front for their criminal activities. The young women in the restaurant were victims being transported across state lines, and my knowledge of their presence made me either a potential recruit or a potential threat. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling," I said, climbing into my cab. "But we're interested in you," the man replied. "Professional drivers with clean records are valuable assets. We pay much better than legitimate freight companies, and we provide excellent job security." I started my engine, but noticed that other vehicles had positioned themselves to block my exit routes. Several SUVs and pickup trucks with heavily tinted windows had moved into positions that would prevent me from leaving the facility. "Wayne, step out of the truck," the man commanded, his friendly demeanor completely gone. "We need to have a more detailed conversation about your future employment opportunities." That's when I saw the armed guards, men in tactical gear who had emerged from the main building, obviously there to ensure that unwilling witnesses didn't have opportunities to escape or contact law enforcement. This wasn't just human trafficking, it was a full-scale criminal enterprise with military-style security. I had two choices: cooperate with human traffickers or try to escape from a facility designed to prevent anyone from leaving without permission. I chose to run. I dropped my truck into gear and floored the accelerator, heading straight for the gap between two SUVs that were blocking the exit. My 80,000 lb truck had enough mass to push through most obstacles, and the criminals weren't expecting a desperate trucker to use his vehicle as a battering ram. The collision sent one SUV spinning across the parking lot while the other was crushed against a concrete barrier. I could hear gunfire behind me as I reached the highway, but my truck's heavy construction provided protection from small arms fire. I grabbed my CB radio as soon as I was clear of the facility. "Mayday, mayday. This is Wayne Carter southbound, on I-40 near mile marker 278. Human trafficking operation in progress at Chrome Horse truck stop. Multiple victims, armed security, need immediate federal response." The radio exploded with responses from other drivers who had heard my transmission. Within minutes, the highway was buzzing with truckers coordinating to block the criminals' escape routes and protect any other drivers who might be approaching the Chrome Horse. FBI agents arrived 30 minutes later, but the Chrome Horse truck stop was empty. The building was abandoned. The fuel pumps were shut down, and there was no evidence of the human trafficking operation I had witnessed. The facility looked like it had been closed for years. "Sir, are you certain about the location?" Agent Rita Morrison asked, studying the abandoned truck stop. "This facility shows no signs of recent activity." But other drivers confirmed my report. The Chrome Horse had been operational just hours earlier, and several truckers had noticed the unusual activity and nervous behavior of the staff. The rapid evacuation suggested that the criminals had procedures for quickly dismantling their operation when law enforcement attention became likely. The investigation that followed revealed that the Chrome Horse was part of a network of fake truck stops used by human trafficking organizations throughout the Southwest. The facilities would operate for weeks or months, processing victims and recruiting drivers, then disappear overnight when they detected law enforcement interest. "These operations are incredibly sophisticated," Agent Morrison explained. "They use legitimate-looking businesses to hide their trafficking activities. And they have intelligence networks that warn them about potential threats. Most victims are transported across multiple states before anyone realizes they're missing. The young women I had seen in the restaurant were victims who had been kidnapped from various locations throughout Mexico and Central America, then transported through the United States to buyers in major cities. The Chrome Horse served as a processing center where victims were prepared for sale and drivers were recruited to transport human cargo. The trucking industry is perfect for human trafficking. Agent Morrison continued, "Drivers have access to routes that avoid official checkpoints, and legitimate freight provides cover for illegal cargo. Most drivers don't know what they're really carrying." Douglas, the nervous fuel attendant, was found 3 days later in a motel outside Phoenix. He had been working undercover for a non-profit organization that investigated human trafficking, gathering information about the Chrome Horse operation. His nervousness had been fear that his cover would be blown before he could document enough evidence to shut down the network. "I've been tracking this organization for 8 months, Douglas explained during his FBI interview. They operate fake truck stops throughout the Southwest, always targeting isolated locations where they can control access and eliminate witnesses. You were lucky to escape." According to Douglas's intelligence, the Chrome Horse network had been operating for over 5 years, processing hundreds of trafficking victims and recruiting dozens of drivers to transport human cargo. The operation generated millions of dollars in profits for criminal organizations with connections throughout North and South America. "They specifically target professional drivers with clean records and legitimate equipment," Douglas said. "Drivers who refuse to cooperate are usually found dead in highway accidents that leave no evidence of criminal activity." The FBI investigation ultimately identified 12 similar facilities operating throughout Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. Most were disguised as legitimate truck stops, repair shops, or freight terminals that appeared normal to casual observers, but served as processing centers for human trafficking operations. These criminals understand that truck drivers are naturally suspicious of unusual situations. Agent Morrison explained they work hard to make their facilities look legitimate, and they have procedures for handling drivers who ask too many questions or witness activities they shouldn't see. 6 months after my encounter at the Chrome Horse, I was contacted by federal agents investigating another trafficking operation in Arizona. They needed experienced drivers to help identify suspicious truck stop activities and provide testimony about how these criminals targeted the trucking industry. My cooperation led to my involvement in a federal task force that monitors truck stops and freight facilities for signs of human trafficking. The work is dangerous but necessary. Every year, thousands of people are transported across America's highways by criminals who use our industry's infrastructure to move human cargo. The trafficking networks are constantly evolving, Agent Morrison warned during one of our task force meetings. They develop new methods for recruiting drivers, new routes for avoiding detection, and new facilities for processing victims. The only way to stop them is through education and vigilance from legitimate drivers. The experience at the Chrome Horse changed how I approach unfamiliar truck stops and service facilities. I research locations before I visit them, check online, reviews and driver forums for reports of unusual activity, and trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right about a facility or its staff. Most importantly, I understand that human trafficking is a clear and present danger to every professional driver. The criminals who operate these networks see us as either assets to be recruited or threats to be eliminated, and they have the resources and ruthlessness to act on those assessments. The Chrome Horse truck stop may be gone, but similar operations continue throughout the country using fake businesses to hide trafficking activities and target legitimate drivers for recruitment or elimination. Every unfamiliar facility is a potential encounter with criminals who treat human life as just another commodity to be bought and sold. Today, when I encounter truck stops that seem too good to be true, or staff members who seem unusually nervous, I remember the young women I saw in the Chrome Horse restaurant and the armed guards who tried to prevent my escape. Sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones who look like legitimate business operators. And the most important thing a driver can do is recognize when a situation isn't what it appears to be. The fuel stop industry has implemented enhanced security measures and reporting procedures since the Chrome Horse investigation. But Agent Morrison warns that trafficking networks continue to adapt and evolve. Every truck stop is a potential front for human trafficking, she explained. The best protection is education, awareness, and the courage to report suspicious activity, even when it might put drivers at personal risk. The Chrome Horse taught me that evil often hides behind familiar business facades, and that the trucking industry's infrastructure can be exploited by criminals who understand our routes, our schedules, and our vulnerabilities. The young women being trafficked through fake truck stops depend on legitimate drivers who are willing to risk their safety to expose these operations. My encounter with human traffickers at a fake fuel stop serves as a reminder that not every business along America's highways is what it appears to be, and that some facilities exist not to serve drivers, but to exploit both truckers and the human cargo they're forced to transport. The Chrome Horse was just one facility in a network that continues to operate throughout the country, and every fuel stop could potentially be a front for crimes against humanity. The real horror isn't supernatural forces or phantom truck stops. It's the very human evil that uses our industry's trust and infrastructure to transport victims who have been kidnapped, sold, and treated as property by criminals who profit from human suffering. But my escape from the Chrome Horse also proved that legitimate drivers can make a difference in fighting human trafficking. By recognizing suspicious activities, reporting unusual situations, and refusing to be intimidated by criminals who try to recruit or silence us, we can help law enforcement shut down operations that destroy countless lives. The Chrome Horse truck stop is gone, but the lesson it taught remains. Vigilance is the price of freedom on America's highways, and sometimes the most important cargo we can protect is our own integrity and the lives of people who depend on drivers who are brave enough to do the right thing when confronted with evil. Every professional driver should understand that we're on the front lines of the fight against human trafficking, whether we want to be or not. The facilities we visit, the routes we travel, and the cargo we haul can all be exploited by criminals who see our industry as a transportation network for their illegal activities. The fuel stop that never forgets taught me that some businesses remember every driver who visits them, not for customer service purposes, but to identify potential recruits for criminal operations or threats that need to be eliminated. Sometimes, the most dangerous stop is the one that knows too much about who you are before you even tell them your name. But it also taught me that one driver's courage to escape and report criminal activity can save countless lives and shut down operations that profit from human misery. The Chrome Horse may be gone, but the fight against human trafficking continues at truck stops throughout America, where legitimate drivers must remain vigilant against criminals who use our industry's infrastructure to transport the evidence of their crimes against humanity. Dead air on Channel 19 should have been my first warning that something was terribly wrong with my run from Portland to Denver. I'm Keith Patterson, been driving for 19 years, and in all that time, I've never experienced complete radio silence on a major interstate during peak trucking hours. But when my dispatcher lost contact with me at 3:17 a.m. somewhere in the high desert of eastern Oregon, I discovered that some communication blackouts are more than technical failures. They're warning signs that you've entered territory where the normal rules of reality no longer apply. The load was routine freight, computer equipment bound for distribution centers in Colorado, running on a tight schedule that required me to make excellent time across Oregon and Idaho. My 2019 Freightliner Cascadia was running perfectly, all systems functioning within normal parameters, when I lost radio contact with both my company dispatcher and every other driver on the highway. Radio silence in the trucking industry is more than an inconvenience. It's a serious safety issue that isolates drivers from the network of communication and mutual assistance that keeps America's highways operating safely. Professional drivers depend on radio contact for weather updates, traffic information, road conditions, and emergency assistance. When that communication network fails, every truck becomes an island of vulnerability on increasingly dangerous highways. My first indication that the communication blackout was more than a technical problem came when I realized that I couldn't remember making radio contact with anyone for over 2 hours. My electronic logging device showed continuous driving time, but I had no memory of the routine CB chatter that normally provided background noise during long-haul runs. According to my trip records, I had been driving east on Interstate 84 through the Columbia River Gorge, then south on US Route 97 through central Oregon toward the Nevada border. Familiar routes that I had traveled dozens of times without incident, through territory where radio coverage was normally excellent due to repeater stations positioned throughout the region. But my CB radio produced only static. My cell phone showed no signal despite being in areas with normally excellent coverage, and my satellite communication system displayed error messages indicating that it couldn't establish contact with dispatch centers. Every form of electronic communication had failed simultaneously, creating isolation that was both unprecedented and terrifying. The silence wasn't just electronic, it was atmospheric. As I drove through the pre-dawn darkness, I began to notice that the normal sounds of highway travel had disappeared. No tire noise from other vehicles, no engine sounds from distant trucks, no wind noise despite driving at highway speeds through open country that should have generated significant atmospheric disturbance. My truck's engine was running normally, but it seemed muffled somehow, as if I were driving through a substance thicker than air. Even my own breathing sounded different in the cab with an echoing quality that suggested vast spaces beyond the confines of my vehicle. At mile marker 127 on US Route 97, I spotted another truck ahead of me. The first vehicle I had seen in over an hour of driving through what should have been busy commercial corridors. The truck appeared to be a Peterbilt, similar to models, from the 1990s, traveling at approximately the same speed as my own vehicle. I attempted to establish radio contact with the other driver. Breaker 1N, this is Cascade Runner southbound on 97, got a northbound Pete ahead of me. Looking for radio. Check. My transmission produced only static, but I noticed that the truck ahead began flashing its marker lights in what appeared to be a response to my radio call. The driver seemed to be acknowledging my presence, even though we couldn't establish voice communication. As I gradually closed the distance to the other truck, I could see that it was indeed a Peterbilt, but the model appeared to be from an earlier era than I had initially estimated. The truck's proportions and styling suggested equipment from the 1980s or even earlier with chrome details and paint schemes that belonged to trucking's golden age. When I pulled alongside the Peterbilt to attempt visual communication with its driver, I discovered something that challenged my understanding of what was possible on America's highways. The cab appeared to be empty. No driver visible behind. The wheel, no movement that would indicate human presence. Just an unmanned truck traveling at highway speeds with perfect precision. I dropped back behind the ghost truck and tried again to establish radio contact using emergency frequencies and multiple channels in hopes of reaching anyone who might be monitoring communications in the area. My attempts produced only static, but the unmanned Peterbilt began flashing its lights in patterns that seemed to respond to my transmission timing. The ghost truck was somehow receiving and responding to my radio calls despite the communication blackout that had isolated me from all other contact. Whatever intelligence was controlling the vehicle understood trucking protocols and was attempting to communicate using the only method available under the circumstances. Over the following hour, I established a primitive communication system with the ghost truck using headlight and marker light flashes. The unmanned vehicle seemed to understand my signals and responded with patterns that suggested intelligence and awareness of our shared situation. When I flashed my lights to indicate fuel concerns, the ghost truck immediately began signaling toward an exit that led to a truck stop I couldn't see from the highway. When I indicated mechanical problems by flashing my hazard lights, the ghost truck reduced speed and began guiding me toward what appeared to be a service area. The truck stop that the ghost truck led me to was unlike any facility I had ever encountered during my trucking career. The buildings looked like they had been constructed decades earlier with architectural styles that belonged to the 1960s or 1970s, but the facility was clearly operational with fuel pumps, service bays, and what appeared to be a restaurant and driver facilities. As I pulled into the truck stop, I noticed that it was populated entirely by unmanned vehicles. Dozens of trucks from various eras parked in orderly rows, all appearing to be in excellent condition despite their obvious age. The facility was operating without any visible human presence, yet fuel pumps were functioning, lights were on, and everything appeared to be maintained in perfect working order. I attempted to fuel my truck using the automated systems, but the pumps wouldn't respond to my credit cards or cash payments. However, when I returned to my cab, I discovered that my fuel tanks had been filled while I was attempting to operate the pumps. Someone or something had provided the service I needed, even though I couldn't see who had performed the work. Inside the restaurant, I found food that had been prepared and left at a table that seemed to be reserved for me. The meal was simple but satisfying, exactly what a tired driver would need to continue a long journey. When I tried to pay for the food, I discovered that no payment was expected or accepted. Throughout my stay at the Ghost truck stop, I could hear faint sounds that might have been radio communications. Distant voices discussing routes, weather conditions, and delivery schedules using terminology and references that belonged to earlier decades of trucking. The conversations seemed to be coming from the unmanned trucks, as if the vehicles themselves were communicating with each other using frequencies I couldn't access. When I returned to my truck to continue my journey, I found that all of my communication equipment was functioning normally again. My CB radio picked up routine chatter from other drivers. My cell phone showed full signal strength, and my satellite system re-established contact with my dispatcher. Cascade Runner, this is dispatch. My radio crackled to life with a transmission from my company's communication center. We've been trying to reach you for the past 6 hours. What's your current location and status? According to my dispatcher, I had been out of contact for 6 hours, during which time they had initiated emergency procedures and contacted law enforcement about a possible missing driver. But according to my electronic logging device and my own memory, only 2 hours had passed since I had lost radio contact. Dispatch, this is Cascade Runner. I experienced a complete communication blackout, but I'm back in contact now. My location. As I paused as I checked my GPS and discovered that I was nearly 300 miles farther along my route than should have been possible given the elapsed time and my recorded driving speeds. The time distortion I had experienced during my communication blackout had somehow transported me across several hundred miles of highway without any memory of the journey. According to my fuel records, I should have needed to refuel during the missing time period, but my tanks showed the same level they had displayed before the blackout began. My dispatcher was relieved to re-establish contact, but couldn't explain the discrepancies between my reported location and the time that had elapsed since our last communication. The GPS tracking systems that monitored my truck's position had also malfunctioned during the blackout, showing no movement for 6 hours, despite clear evidence that I had continued traveling. As I continued toward Denver, I began encountering other drivers who reported similar experiences of communication blackouts and time distortion on the same stretch of highway. The phenomenon seemed to occur most frequently during overnight hours, when traffic was light and atmospheric conditions created optimal circumstances for whatever force was causing the disruptions. That stretch of Route 97 is known for radio problems, explained a veteran driver named Carl Wagner when I shared my experience at a truck stop in Nevada. A lot of drivers report losing communications for hours at a time, then finding themselves much farther along their route than they should be. Some kind of electromagnetic anomaly that affects both radio equipment and time perception. Carl's explanation was reassuring, but didn't account for the ghost truck that had guided me to the unmanned truck stop, or the service I had received from invisible attendants who had somehow known exactly what I needed. The communication blackout had been more than an equipment failure. It had been entry into a parallel version of the highway system operated by forces I couldn't understand. Over the following months, I researched the phenomenon of communication blackouts on US Route 97 and discovered a pattern of reports dating back to the early days of CB radio adoption in the trucking industry. Drivers consistently reported losing contact for hours at a time, only to find themselves farther along their routes than should have been possible. The reports often included encounters with unmanned vehicles, truck stops that appeared and disappeared, and assistance from invisible helpers who provided exactly the services that drivers needed. The phenomenon seemed to be some kind of supernatural highway system that operated parallel to the normal transportation network. Most disturbing were the accounts of drivers who had never returned from their communication blackouts. Over the past 30 years, at least a dozen professional drivers had simply vanished while traveling Route 97 through Central Oregon. Their trucks found abandoned, but their bodies never located. Some drivers get pulled into the ghost highway permanently, Carl Wagner warned me during a follow-up conversation. They lose radio contact and never come back. Their trucks are found empty beside the road, but the drivers themselves disappear into whatever dimension that parallel highway system occupies. The ghost highway theory explained my experience better than any conventional explanation. During my communication blackout, I had briefly entered a supernatural transportation network operated by the spirits of drivers who had died on the highway over the decades. The unmanned trucks, the ghost truck stop, and the invisible assistance I had received were all part of a system designed to help living drivers navigate safely through territory that existed outside normal space and time. I've driven Route 97 many times since my communication blackout, but I've never again lost radio contact for extended periods. However, I monitor CB channels carefully for other drivers who might be experiencing communication problems, understanding that isolation on the ghost highway can be temporary or permanent, depending on factors I don't fully understand. The silent. Radio taught me that communication is more than just electronic contact. It's our connection to the community of living drivers who share America's highways. When that connection is severed, we become vulnerable to forces that operate outside normal reality. Forces that might offer assistance or might claim us as permanent residents of their parallel highway system. Today, I carry backup communication equipment and maintain regular contact with multiple dispatchers to ensure that any communication blackout is quickly noticed and addressed. The ghost highway is still out there, offering supernatural assistance to some drivers while claiming others as permanent residents of a transportation network that exists beyond the reach of normal radio contact. The unmarked vehicles that populate the ghost highway continue their eternal journeys, guided by drivers who died pursuing their roads, but never stopped working their runs. Some of them offer assistance to living drivers who briefly enter their domain, while others serve as warnings about the dangers of remaining too long in territory where the normal rules of communication and time no longer apply. My brief visit to the Ghost Highway reminded me that the trucking community extends beyond the living, encompassing spirits who continue their work long after their earthly careers have ended. The silent radio that marked my entry into their domain serves as a reminder that some communication blackouts are doorways to dimensions where different rules apply and different dangers await unwary travelers. The ghost trucks that travel America's highways during the darkest hours carry more than cargo. They carry the memories and responsibilities of drivers who take their commitment so seriously that death hasn't ended their dedication to keeping America's freight moving.